This is the story of Akoshua, the most beautiful girl in 7 villages, and the supernatural husband who claimed her soul. But be warned, dear listeners, for this tale will chill your blood and make you question everything you think you know about love, pride, and the thin veil between our world and the realm of the dead. In the ancient village of Kwame Bra, where the Niger River curved like a golden serpent through the red earth, there lived a girl whose beauty was spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. Her name was Akoshua, and she was 17 years old when our story begins. Picture her, if you will, skin like polished mahogany that caught the sunlight and held it, eyes that sparkled with intelligence and mischief, and hair that she wore in intricate braids adorned with cowrie shells and gold beads inherited from her grandmother. When Akoshua walked through the village market, conversation stopped. When she laughed, even the birds seemed to pause their singing to listen. But here's where our tale takes its first dark turn, dear listeners. Akoshua knew she was beautiful. More than that, she was intoxicated by her own beauty, drunk on the power it gave her over others. Look at her, the village women would whisper as she passed. Walking like she owns the very ground beneath her feet. Pride, old Nana Akoto would mutter, shaking her gray head as she watched the girl from her position under the ancient baobab tree where she told fortunes and dispensed wisdom. Pride is a poison that tastes sweet going down but burns like fire in the belly. But Akoshua paid no attention to such warnings. She was too busy counting her suitors, and rejecting them all. First came Kofi, the blacksmith's son, strong as an ox and gentle as a lamb. He brought her family 3 goats and a bolt of the finest cloth from the coastal traders. Akoshua looked at his calloused hands and turned away. These hands have known too much work, she declared. I am meant for finer things. Then came Kweku, son of the village chief, who offered her father's family a bride price that would make them wealthy beyond their dreams. He was handsome, educated, and kind. The entire village expected her to accept. But do you know what Akoshua did? She laughed. Right in his face. In front of the entire village assembly. You think your title makes you worthy of me? She said, her voice carrying across the gathering like a blade. I am Akoshua. My beauty is a gift from the gods themselves. I will not waste it on mere mortals who grovel in the dust. The village gasped. Even her own parents looked away in shame. But Akoshua? She held her head high and walked away, her jewelry chiming like bells in the stunned silence. Week after week, month after month, suitors came. The potter's artistic son, the trader's wealthy heir, even a young priest whose wisdom was renowned throughout the region. All were rejected. All were found wanting by Akoshua's impossibly high standards. What exactly are you waiting for, my daughter? Her mother, Alma, asked one evening as they prepared the evening meal. You're 17 now. Soon you'll be 18, then 19. Beauty fades, child, but a good husband and family last forever. Akoshua stirred the palm nut soup with deliberate, measured movements. I am waiting, she said, for a man whose beauty matches my own. Whose wealth surpasses that of kings. Whose wisdom flows deeper than the great rivers. Why should I, the most beautiful girl in 7 villages, settle for anything less than perfection itself? Her father, Apoku, looked up from where he was carving a new stool. The ancestors teach us that perfection belongs only to the spirits, Akoshua. We mortals must find happiness in what is real and good. But Akoshua had already made up her mind. She would wait for perfection, no matter how long it took. Little did she know, dear listeners, that something, or someone, in the spirit realm was listening. It was during the festival of first harvest that he appeared. The entire village was gathered in the central square, drums beating their ancient rhythms, dancers moving like flames in the firelight, and the air thick with the smoke of roasted meat and palm wine. Akoshua sat with the other unmarried girls, but apart from them as always. She wore her finest Kent cloth, deep blue with gold threads that seemed to capture and hold the firelight. Her neck was adorned with her grandmother's gold necklace, and her wrists clinked with bangles of brass and silver. She was watching the dancers with that familiar look of mild disdain when the drumming suddenly stopped. Not gradually, not naturally, but all at once, as if an invisible hand had commanded silence. The dancers froze mid-step. The children stopped their playing. Even the crackling of the fire seemed to quiet. And into this unnatural silence walked him. He was tall, taller than any man in the village, with broad shoulders and a bearing that spoke of nobility. His skin seemed to glow with an inner light, smooth and unblemished as if he'd never known a day of hard work or worry. His hair was perfectly arranged, adorned with gold ornaments that caught the firelight and threw it back in brilliant flashes. But it was his clothes that truly took the breath away. His kent cloth was woven from threads that seemed to shift and shimmer with colors that had no names, deeper than indigo, brighter than gold, richer than the finest crimson dyes. Around his neck hung chains of gold so pure they seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. "By the ancestors," someone whispered. "Look at him." "Is he a prince?" another voice murmured. "A king, surely." The stranger's eyes swept across the gathering, and Akojua felt her heart skip a beat when his gaze found hers. His eyes were impossible to describe. Deep as wells, bright as stars, ancient as the earth itself. When he looked at her, she felt as if he could see straight through to her very soul. He began to walk toward her, and with each step, Akojua noticed something that made her skin prickle with unease. The flames of the fires didn't seem to cast his shadow properly. Where other people's shadows danced and flickered on the ground, his seemed absent. Or perhaps it was there but somehow wrong, shaped like something that wasn't quite human. But then he smiled, and all such concerns fled from her mind. His smile was radiant, transformative, like the sun breaking through storm clouds. When he spoke, his voice was like honey poured over thunder. "I have come," he said, his words carrying clearly across the silent gathering, "seeking the most beautiful maiden in all the land. And I believe I have found her." He stopped directly in front of Akojua, and she felt herself growing dizzy under the intensity of his gaze. "You are Akojua," he said, and it wasn't a question. Yes," she managed to say, her usual confidence momentarily shaken by his overwhelming presence. "I am Kwame," he said, inclining his head in a gesture that was somehow both respectful and commanding. "Son of Chief Osei of the Northern Kingdoms, ruler of lands that stretch beyond the Great Desert. I have traveled many days and nights to find you, for tales of your beauty have reached even our distant realm." The village erupted in whispers. The Northern Kingdoms. Everyone had heard of them, wealthy beyond imagination, powerful beyond measure, but so distant that few had ever seen anyone from those legendary lands. Kwame reached into a leather pouch at his side and withdrew a handful of gold dust that glittered like stars in his palm. "I offer this as a token of my serious intentions," he said, letting the precious dust pour through his fingers to sparkle on the ground at Akojua's feet. But old Nana Akoto, sitting in her place of honor near the great fire, was frowning. She squinted at the stranger with her ancient eyes, muttering under her breath and fingering the collection of amulets around her neck. "Something's not right," she whispered to the woman beside her. "Look at his feet." "What about them?" "Look closely. Do you see how they don't quite seem to touch the ground? And the dogs, look at the dogs." Indeed, the village dogs had all retreated to the edges of the gathering, whimpering and pressing themselves low to the ground, their hackles raised in fear. But Akojua saw none of this. She was lost in Kwame's impossible beauty, in the promise of the life he represented, a life of luxury and status that would match her own estimation of her worth. "I would speak with your father," Kwame said, his voice formal now, following the proper customs. "If he will receive me." Apoku rose slowly from his seat, his carpenter's instincts making him cautious. There was something about this stranger that set his teeth on edge, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. "You are welcome in my home," he said carefully. "Though perhaps we should speak tomorrow, when we are all clearer of head." Kwame's smile never wavered. I appreciate your caution, honored father. But I must depart soon on urgent business for my father's kingdom. I had hoped we might speak tonight. And so it was that the village found itself witness to the strangest, most hurried courtship negotiation anyone could remember. Kwame's bride price was beyond generous, it was spectacular. Gold, ivory, fine cloth, cattle, and promises of trade agreements that would make Kwame Bra the richest village in the region. But all the while, as the negotiations proceeded, strange things began to happen. The fire would flicker without any wind. Children began crying for no reason. And several people swore they saw movement in the shadows that didn't match any of the people gathered around the fire. Nana Akoto could bear it no longer. She stood up, her old bones creaking, and approached the gathering. Wait, she called out, her voice carrying the authority of her 70 years and her position as the village's connection to the spirit world. There are questions that must be asked. Customs that must be observed. Kwame turned to look at her, and for just a moment, just the briefest instant, his beautiful face seemed to shift and change, becoming something skull-like and terrible. But then it was back to normal, and Nana Akoto wondered if her old eyes had played tricks on her. Of course, honored grandmother, Kwame said with perfect courtesy. What questions would you ask? Nana Akoto approached slowly, her walking stick tapping against the packed earth. Tell us of your family. Your mother's name. Your father's deeds. The spirits of your ancestors. For the first time since his arrival, Kwame hesitated. It was only for a heartbeat, but in that tiny pause, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. My family, he said finally, dwells far from here, in realms where the living seldom venture. My father's deeds are known in places where memory is long and forgiveness is difficult to come by. As for my ancestors, his smile became sharp, predatory. They are very much still with me. The way he said it made several people shiver, but Akojua was too enchanted to notice. Here was the perfect man she had been waiting for, beautiful, wealthy, exotic, and clearly smitten with her. I accept, she announced, before her father could speak. I will marry you, Kwame of the Northern Kingdoms. A cheer went up from some of the villagers, but it was a hollow sound, lacking the joy that usually accompanied such announcements. Too many people had noticed too many strange things. Kwame smiled his radiant smile. Then let us wed tomorrow night, he said. For as I mentioned, my duties call me home soon after. Tomorrow? Apoku protested. But the preparations, the ceremonies, these things take time to do properly. I have brought my own priest, Kwame said smoothly, gesturing to a figure that no one had noticed before, a tall, thin man in flowing robes who stood so still he might have been a shadow. And I assure you, all will be done according to the ancient customs. As the gathering finally began to disperse, people drifting back to their homes with much to discuss, Nana Akoto caught Apoku's arm. Don't let this happen, she whispered urgently. I've cast the cowrie shells 3 times tonight, and each time they tell the same story, danger, death, and a journey to places where the living should not go. But Apoku spread his hands helplessly. What can I do? She's accepted him publicly. The bride price is already agreed upon. To refuse now would bring shame on our entire family. Better shame than what's coming, Nana Akoto muttered, but she knew it was too late. The wheels had been set in motion, and like a boulder rolling down a mountainside, they could not be stopped. As the village settled into uneasy sleep that night, none of them noticed that Kwame never entered the guest house that had been prepared for him. Instead, he simply faded away, like mist before the morning sun. And in her sleep, Akojua dreamed of a wedding that took place not in her village, but in a realm of shadows and whispers, where the guests were pale as moonlight and their eyes held the cold gleam of stars reflected in still water. The next day dawned gray and overcast, unusual for the dry season. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if a great storm was building just beyond the horizon. But there were no clouds, just an endless expanse of dull, pewter sky that seemed to press down on the village like a weight. Akoju awoke with a strange taste in her mouth, metallic and cold, like she'd been sucking on iron. She couldn't remember her dreams clearly, but they had left her with a feeling of unease that she couldn't shake. Her mother was already up, preparing the traditional pre-wedding meal that the bride's family would share. But her hand shook as she ground the millet, and her eyes were red as if she'd been crying. "Mama?" Akojua sat up on her sleeping mat. "What's wrong?" Alma turned to her daughter, and for a moment, her face was a mask of such profound sorrow that Akojua felt a chill run down her spine. "I had dreams," her mother said quietly. "Terrible dreams. I saw you walking away from us, but when you turned back, your face was empty. Like looking at a mask with nothing behind it." "Dreams are just dreams, Mama," Akojua said, but even as she spoke, she felt that metallic taste grow stronger in her mouth. Her father appeared in the doorway, his usually cheerful face drawn and worried. "The stranger, Kwame, he's already at the shrine, making preparations with his priest." "I've never seen wedding preparations like these." "What do you mean?" Akojua asked. Apoka rubbed his forehead. "They're using different rituals. Not the ceremonies I learned from my father, or he from his father. Ancient things. Older than memory. And the priest." He shuddered. "When I tried to speak with him, it was like talking to an echo. His voice seemed to come from somewhere else, somewhere far away." But Akojua's excitement about her perfect wedding was stronger than her family's fears. She spent the day preparing herself, bathing in water scented with oils and herbs, braiding her hair with threads of gold, and adorning herself with every piece of jewelry her family owned. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked disturbingly like blood, the village gathered once again in the central square. But this time, the atmosphere was different. People moved quietly, spoke in whispers, and kept glancing over their shoulders as if expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. The wedding altar had been prepared, but not in the traditional way. Instead of the usual flowers and palm fronds, it was decorated with strange plants that none of the villagers recognized. Dark, twisted vines with thorns that seemed to gleam like teeth, and flowers that were beautiful but somehow wrong, too perfect, too symmetrical, like they had been carved from bone rather than grown from earth. When Kwame appeared, he was even more magnificent than the night before. His wedding robe seemed to be woven from moonlight itself, and the gold at his throat and wrists caught the firelight and threw it back in patterns that hurt to look at directly. But Nana Akoto, watching from her place among the elders, noticed something that made her blood run cold. She could see through him. Just slightly, just at the edges, but she could see the ground behind him through his body, as if he were made of colored glass instead of flesh and blood. "Stop this," she cried out, rising to her feet with the help of her walking stick. "Stop this madness before it's too late." But her voice was swallowed by the sound of the drums, which had begun to beat in a rhythm that seemed to match the pounding of frightened hearts. And Kwame's priest, if that's what he was, raised his hands and began to chant in a language that predated human speech. Akojua emerged from her father's house, and even she could feel that something was terribly wrong. The air around her seemed thick, hard to breathe, and with each step toward the altar, she felt as if she were walking deeper underwater. But she looked so beautiful in her wedding attire, her grandmother's finest Kent cloth, gold jewelry that caught and held the firelight, flowers in her hair that should have been lovely but somehow looked like they were already wilting, that the villagers gasped despite their fear. As she approached Kwame, he smiled his perfect smile, but this time, she noticed that his teeth were too white, too sharp, and when he opened his mouth to speak the wedding vows, his breath was cold as a winter wind. The ceremony proceeded with inexorable momentum. The priest spoke words that seemed to twist in the air, forming shapes that existed for just a moment before dissolving into darkness. When Kwame took Akojua's hand, she nearly cried out. His skin was ice cold and felt somehow hollow, like touching the surface of deep water. Do you, Akojua, daughter of Apoku and Amma, take this man to be your husband, in this world and all worlds beyond? The priest intoned. Akojua opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. Around her, the firelight was growing dimmer, though the flames themselves hadn't changed. It was as if the very air was absorbing the light, drinking it down like thirsty earth drinks rain. She began, and in that moment of hesitation, she caught sight of her reflection in Kwame's eyes. What she saw there was not herself. It was empty air. A blank space where her reflection should have been, as if she were already beginning to fade from the world of the living. But before she could react, before she could pull away, Kwame's grip on her hand tightened like a vice, and he spoke for her. She accepts, he said in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The bond is sealed. The priest raised his arms, and the world exploded into darkness. When the villagers' vision cleared, they found themselves standing in the same square, around the same fires, but everything was subtly different. The air was thinner, colder. The stars overhead were arranged in patterns that didn't quite match what they should be. And when they looked around for the bride and groom, they found nothing but empty air and the lingering scent of flowers that bloom only in graveyards. Akojua, her mother screamed, running to the altar. "Where is my daughter? Where is she?" But there was no answer except the wind through the baobab trees, carrying whispers and languages that human tongues were never meant to speak. Nana Akoto stood slowly, her ancient face etched with grief and terrible understanding. "She's gone," she said quietly. "Gone to a place where the living cannot follow, bound to a husband who should have been buried long ago." "What do you mean?" Apoku demanded, grabbing the old woman's shoulders. "Where is my daughter?" Nana Akoto's eyes filled with tears that reflected the firelight like drops of amber. "She has married a ghost, Apoku. A spirit of the dead who has claimed her for his bride. And now she must live in his world, the realm between life and death, where beauty means nothing and time has no meaning." As if summoned by her words, a wind began to blow from the north, cold and carrying with it the sound of distant laughter that might have been joy or might have been screaming. It whirled around the wedding altar, scattering the strange flowers and vines, leaving behind only the faint outline of two figures pressed into the earth like shadows burned into stone. And in that outline, if you looked closely, you could see the shape of a tall man and a beautiful woman, hand in hand, walking away into a darkness that had no end. When Akojua opened her eyes, she was no longer in her village. She stood on a path made of what looked like crushed pearls and silver dust, stretching ahead of her into a landscape that defied description. The sky above was not blue or gray or any color that had a name. It shifted and swirled like oil on water, sometimes transparent enough to show stars that pulsed with cold light, sometimes thick as velvet and dark as the space between thoughts. There was no sun, but everything was lit with a strange, sourceless illumination that cast no shadows. "Welcome to my realm, beloved wife," Kwame's voice came from beside her, and when she turned to look at him, she had to bite back a scream. He was still beautiful, perhaps even more beautiful than before, but now his beauty was obviously supernatural. His skin had a translucent quality, like he was carved from the finest jade and lit from within. His eyes held depths that seemed to go on forever, and when he moved, it was with a grace that was too perfect, too smooth, like he was floating just above the ground rather than walking on it. "Where are we?" Akojua whispered, her voice sounding small and lost in the vast space around them. "This is the realm between worlds," Kwame said, taking her hand in his cold grip. "The place where spirits dwell when they cannot, or will not, pass on to final rest. It is here that I have waited for centuries, searching for a bride beautiful enough to share my eternal existence." As they walked along the pearl dust path, Akojua began to see other figures in the distance. They moved with the same unnatural grace as Kwame, and when they came closer, she could see that they were all beautiful, men and women of ethereal loveliness, but their beauty was hollow, empty, like exquisite masks with nothing behind them. "Who are they?" she asked. The citizens of my realm, Kwame replied. Spirits who, like me, could not bear to leave behind the world of beauty and desire. We exist here in perfection, unchanging, eternal. But as they drew nearer to these perfect beings, Akoshua noticed something that filled her with dread. They were all looking at her with expressions of desperate hunger, as if she were food and they had been starving for centuries. Fresh life, one of them whispered as she passed. So warm, murmured another. It's been so long since we've had fresh life among us. Kwame led her away from them, but she could feel their eyes following her like cold fingers trailing along her skin. They came to a great palace that seemed to be built from crystallized music and frozen moonlight. Its towers stretched impossibly high, and its walls were transparent but somehow solid, allowing Akoshua to see through them into rooms that contained wonders and horrors in equal measure. This is our home, Kwame said, and his voice held a note of pride that seemed to echo from very far away. Here you will want for nothing. You will be forever beautiful, forever young, forever perfect. He led her through corridors lined with mirrors that showed not reflections but memories, scenes of lives that had been lived and lost, love affairs that had ended in tragedy, moments of beauty that had been preserved like flowers pressed between the pages of a book. In what he called their wedding chamber, he showed her treasures beyond imagining. Gowns woven from spider silk and starlight, jewelry made from crystallized tears and solidified laughter, perfumes that captured the essence of every flower that had ever bloomed. All of this is yours, my beloved, he said, his cold hands touching her face with reverent gentleness. In return, all I ask is that you remain here with me, forever young and beautiful, never aging, never dying, never leaving. And if I want to visit my family? Akoshua asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. Kwame's smile was sad and terrible. Your family exists in the world of the living, my dear one. That world is close to you now. You belong to the realm of spirits, just as I do. It was then that the full horror of her situation began to sink in. She was trapped. Trapped in a place between life and death, married to a ghost, surrounded by hungry spirits who saw her as nothing more than a source of the life force they no longer possessed. I want to go home, she whispered. This is your home now, Kwame replied, and though his voice was gentle, there was steel beneath the silk. You made your choice when you accepted my proposal. The binding was completed when you spoke the wedding vows, or rather, when I spoke them for you. There is no going back. That night, though night and day had no meaning in this realm where time moved like honey mixed with dreams, Akoshua lay on a bed made of cloud stuff and tried to sleep. But every time she closed her eyes, she could hear the whispers of the other spirits, pressing against the walls of the palace like water against a dam. Share her with us, they pleaded. Just a taste of her warmth. A drop of her life to sustain us. She has so much, and we have nothing. And gradually, Akoshua began to understand the truth. She was not just Kwame's bride, she was food. Her life force, her warmth, her vitality, these were what sustained the spirits in this realm. And slowly, inevitably, they would drain her dry, leaving her just another empty, beautiful shell wandering the pearl dust paths for eternity. It was during what might have been her third day in the spirit realm. Time moved strangely there, sometimes fast as a hummingbird's wings, sometimes slow as honey in winter, that Akoshua discovered she was not the first bride Kwame had brought to his palace. She was exploring the endless corridors, trying to map the impossible architecture of her prison, when she heard something that made her heart leap with hope, a human voice, singing a lullaby she remembered from her childhood. Following the sound, she found herself in a garden where flowers bloomed in colors that had no names and trees bore fruit that looked like tiny stars. And there, sitting by a fountain that flowed upward instead of down, was a young woman about her own age. The woman was beautiful, they were all beautiful here, but her beauty had a faded quality, like a painting left too long in the sun. Her skin was pale as moonlight, her eyes held the distant look of someone who has seen too much, and when she moved, it was with the slow, careful motions of someone who was very, very tired. Hello, Akoshua called softly, not wanting to startle her. The woman looked up, and for a moment, her face blazed with such joy and relief that she looked almost alive again. Another new bride, she whispered, rising gracefully to her feet. Oh, my dear sister, I am so sorry for you, and so grateful to see you. Sister? Akoshua moved closer, studying the woman's face. There was something familiar about her features, something that tugged at the edges of memory. We are all sisters here, the woman said with a sad smile. All of us who fell for his perfect beauty, all of us who thought we deserved nothing less than perfection itself. I am Ephua, daughter of the goldsmith Yah, from the village of Kokrobite by the great ocean. Akoshua gasped. Kokrobite. But that's impossible. My grandmother told me stories of Kokrobite, but that village was destroyed by raiders 50 years ago. Ephua nodded slowly. Time moves differently here, dear sister. I have been Kwame's bride for what feels like a lifetime, but in your world, it has been 5 decades. Before me was Araba, who came from a fishing village that no longer exists. Before her was Akua, we share a name, you and I and she, who lived when your great-grandmother was young. How many? Akoshua whispered, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Come, Ephua said, taking her hand. Let me show you. She led Akoshua deeper into the garden, past flowers that sang when the wind touched them and trees whose leaves showed visions of distant places. And there, in a grove of silver trees, Akoshua saw them. They sat in a circle, a dozen women of various ages, all beautiful, all wearing the faded remnants of wedding attire from different eras. Some wore the gold jewelry and Kent cloth of Akoshua's own people. Others were adorned in styles she didn't recognize, brass ornaments from the northern kingdoms, shell necklaces from coastal peoples, leather and beadwork from the desert tribes. All of them had the same look in their eyes, the hollow, distant gaze of people who had been drained of something essential, leaving behind only beautiful shells. Sisters, Ephua called softly, we have a new bride among us. They looked up with expressions of welcome tinged with sorrow, and one by one, they told Akoshua their stories. There was Abina, who had been the most sought-after maiden in her village until she rejected every suitor for being beneath her standards. Kwame had appeared during her 18th birthday celebration, claiming to be a prince from across the great desert. There was Ya, a chief's daughter who had been so proud of her intelligence that she declared no man could be her intellectual equal. Kwame had come to her as a scholar, speaking of books and wisdom beyond mortal understanding. There was Adoma, a famous beauty who had turned down marriage proposals from 3 different kings because their kingdoms weren't wealthy enough to suit her. Kwame had appeared with treasures beyond imagination, claiming to rule lands richer than any mortal realm. Each story was different in its details but the same in its essence, proud, vain women who had rejected earthly love in search of impossible perfection, only to be claimed by a ghost who fed on their life force and trapped them in his realm between worlds. How long do we have? Akoshua asked, though she dreaded the answer. That depends, said the oldest of the brides, a woman who introduced herself as Aba and who wore jewelry in styles so ancient that Akoshua's people had forgotten them. It depends on how much life force you brought with you, and how strongly you fight against the draining. The draining? Aba gestured around the circle. Look at us, sister. Really look. Do you see how we've all faded? When I first arrived here, and that was longer ago than your people have been counting years, I burned bright as a flame. Now I am barely an ember. Each day, each hour, Kwame and his realm feed on what we are, drawing away our vitality, our essence, our very souls.